Today, we are digging into a history of psychoanalysis that is, well, it's surprising. It feels like it was almost deliberately forgotten. And honestly, it's a story that challenges pretty much everything we think we know about Sigmund Freud and that famous couch. Let's get into it.
Okay, so when I say the word psychoanalysis, what's the first thing that pops into your head? No, seriously, just take a second. What's the image?
I'm willing to bet it's something like this, right? A quiet, kind of fancy office, a big leather couch, maybe a guy with a beard and a notepad. And it's all about this deep dive into the mind of one single person. You know, the classic image we see in movies. But what if I told you that that image is not the whole story? Not even close. What if the real, hidden history of psychoanalysis isn't locked away in that quiet room, but is actually out in the streets, tangled up in social revolutions, and part of a radical fight for justice? So how did this hidden history even come to light? Well, our story really kicks off with a scholar named Daniel Gastambide. He's browsing a bookstore, and he stumbles on a title that just seems impossible. It was called Freud's Free Clinics. And reading that book completely shattered everything he thought he knew about the man. I mean, the difference is just night and day. The stereotype we all have is Freud as this kind of colonialist, elitist thinker making therapy for the rich. But the history that Gazdambi uncovered, it showed a totally different person, a marginalized Jewish man, a passionate advocate for social justice, and get this, the founder of free clinics for the poor. And this wasn't just some side hobby for him. It was deeply tied to his own identity. You have to remember, in the racial thinking of that era, being Jewish was often explicitly linked with being black. Freud was part of a marginalized group, and that gave him a perspective on race, culture, and politics that most of his modern critics completely miss.
And this wasn't just some subtext. Freud said it out loud, very clearly. In a huge speech back in 1918, he basically declared that mental health issues, what he called neuroses, were a full-blown public health crisis, as dangerous to the people as tuberculosis. And he argued that it was psychoanalysis's duty to treat the great mass of our fellow men, not just the wealthy.
The thing is, Freud wasn't some lone wolf in this. He was actually part of a much bigger, much more politically progressive movement. A lot of the early psychoanalysts were socialists or Marxists, and they were all deeply interested in how our society shapes, and sometimes damages, the individual mind. And you can literally trace how this radical idea was passed down and built upon. It starts with Ferenczi, who focused on how oppressed people start to believe the negative things society says about them. Then Fenichel takes that and uses a Marxist framework to show how scapegoating is used to keep power structures in place. And all of that leads to Fromm, who dives deep into how our culture itself can be the root cause of mental illness. It's a powerful chain of thought. Okay, and this is where the story gets really wild, because these ideas didn't just stay in academic circles in Europe. They spread across the globe and became this powerful tool in some of the biggest movements for liberation in the 20th century. The connections are just stunning. Our first stop is 1920s New York City, right in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. This was this incredible explosion of Black art, culture, and thought. And believe it or not, psychoanalytic ideas were right there at the heart of the conversation. And we're talking about real-world action here. The legendary novelists Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison actually started a free psychoanalytic clinic right in Harlem. At the same time, you had white psychoanalysts like Harry Stack Sullivan going down to the Jim Crow South to work with Black sociologists, researching the deep psychological wounds that racism inflicts. This collaboration is a vital, missing link in both Black history and the history of psychology. All right, from Harlem, we're going to jump across the Atlantic to another huge fight for freedom, the Algerian Revolution against French colonial rule. And here, psychoanalysis became this crucial weapon for understanding the psychology of being colonized. The psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who was a key figure in the revolution, used these ideas to develop his famous concept of identification with the oppressor. He showed how colonialism isn't just about armies and politics. It's a battle that gets inside your head. It's the process where oppressed people can start to internalize the hateful views of the very people who are oppressing them. And that idea, it keeps evolving. Over in Brazil, the educator Paulo Freire introduced this concept of conscientización, or what we'd call critical consciousness. It's that aha moment. It's the process of waking up and seeing how all these invisible cultural rules are designed to maintain power, and then, and this is the important part, using that new awareness to change yourself and your world.
So you take all of these threads, from Freud's radical idea for free clinics, to the work in Harlem, to Fanon and Freire, and they all come together to create this whole new field, liberation psychology. It was founded by Ignacio Martin Baró in Latin America, specifically to address the mental health needs of the poor and the oppressed. So, this brings us to the big question, the central mystery of this whole story. If this history of psychoanalysis is so rich, so radical, so connected to all these global movements for freedom, why on earth have most of us never heard any of it? Where did it go?
It's a huge question, right? How does something this significant just get erased from the history books? Well, the answer is tragic, and it tells us a lot about how history gets written. Gazdambide's central argument is this. When Jewish psychoanalysts fled the Nazis and came to America, they were desperate for safety. And safety, they thought, meant assimilation. So they started to distance themselves from their progressive, radical European roots and from the very marginalized Jewish identity that had connected them to other oppressed groups. As Gastambide puts it, by walling off of their Jewish identity, they in turn created walls between psychoanalysis and people of color. So, okay, this is more than just a cool history lesson. Uncovering this lost history actually matters immensely right now because it is actively reshaping what therapy can, and maybe should, look like today. It's given us this incredible concept called the social third. The idea is really simple, but it's profound. It says that there are never just two people in the therapy room. There's the therapist, there's the patient, and there's a third, invisible presence, the entire social, political, and cultural world that shapes both of them. And this brings the whole story full circle, doesn't it? Rediscovering this lost, radical history is inspiring a whole new generation of therapists. The call to action is becoming really clear, that psychoanalysts can't just sit and listen in an office. They also need to have, as Gastambide writes, their feet marching in the streets advocating for social justice and equity. And that really leaves us with one last massive question to think about. If a history this important, this foundational to a whole field of thought, can be so completely buried for decades, it just makes you wonder, what other crucial stories have been lost? And what hidden histories do we need to start digging for right now?